Hey, world history students. Today we're going to continue talking about absolutism, absolute monarchs in Europe. We've already talked about Spain and France and guys like Philip II and Louis XIV. We're going to continue talking about some of those other rulers in other parts of Europe. And today we're going to focus on Russia and England. All right, so in Russia during this time period, about the same time as the Age of Exploration is kicking off, they were finally getting rid of the rule by the Mongols. That's guys like Genghis Khan and Kublai Khan you might have seen from movies or previous classes. But they controlled Russia for a long period of time as part of their empire. And in 1480, Russian rulers finally got rid of the Mongols, and they started putting in place Russian rulers to take over and rule the country. And this really didn't completely unify Russia until Ivan IV took over. And he really strengthened the monarchy. He was very ruthless in his tactics, and he didn't trust anybody really. And so much so that he killed his only son because he thought that he was going to plot to overthrow him. He was very distrustful of people. And so what he did was he started taking more and more power from anybody else in Russia during that time. All of the land-owning nobles called boyars are going to be basically cast out and thrown aside and said, Ivan says, I'm going to take all the power. I am absolute in my rule, and nobody should be able to question me. He's going to do a lot of executions because people do question him. And when they do that, he executes them or puts them in prison, which is where he's going to get the name Ivan the Terrible. However, he did change the monarchy in Russia for sure. He started calling himself the Tsar, which is an allusion back to Roman times, Caesar. This is the Russian word for Caesar. And so he wanted an empire kind of like Rome had in its glory days. And so Ivan IV is going to be very absolute, and where a lot of the rulers in Russia are going to get their cues from in terms of how to be an absolute ruler. However, like I told you, he killed his son, so he didn't have a male heir, and so his cousins, the Romanovs, would take over the throne in Russia, and they would rule for 300 years, from 1613 all the way until the Communist Revolution in 1917. And that's a long period of time as Tsar. Probably one of the greatest of which was Peter. Peter was the Tsar of Russia starting from about 1782, and his great claim to fame was that he westernized Russia, which is a big deal. He modernized them by taking ideas when he toured France and England. He realized that they had a lot of great stuff there from their Age of Exploration and from the Renaissance and all these great things that Russia kind of got left out of because they were under Mongol rule. And he took all these ideas and brought them back with him. And, he really improved Russia as a country, brought them to the world stage and closer to the great powers of France and England and those other places during that time period. Another thing he did was he took over a large portion of land. He built a very large army like he saw in France and England. And he started conquering lands all over, from the Atlantic all the way to Siberia, which is a huge territory. And that's where Russia gets its territory from today, was Peter the Great's expeditions to these places. One of the best things that he did was he took a warm water port here in St. Petersburg, which is really good because most of Russia's ports were frozen during the wintertime, and they could not trade and use their mercantilism to generate trade and export their goods and create wealth, because all of their ships couldn't get into the port because it was frozen over. So what he did was he took the land now called St. Petersburg, which is a warm water trading port, and now they could trade at any time of the year, and brought in a whole lot more wealth, especially New World goods that were starting to come in. Probably the most important of which was potatoes, which doesn't seem like a very important crop until you realize that most of Russia was having problems with starvation, that people didn't have enough food. And potatoes, believe it or not, grow really well in Russia. and it became a very important staple of their diet. And now it prevented people from starving to death, which is going to cause people to love Peter the Great for all these things that he did. And Russia is going to be a world leader later on, and it really never would have happened without Peter the Great's westernization and modernization of Russia. So he did a lot for the country. So we can see the downsides and the good sides of absolute rule just in Russia. All right, here is a map. This is St. Petersburg. Notice all of their ports before were all frozen. This is the Arctic Ocean. They didn't have any warm water ports, which is why they took this land here on the Atlantic. Now they can trade at any time. And they also went all the way here to Siberia, which is almost in Alaska. So it's a huge amount of territory. All right, moving on to England. England has a long history of hating absolute monarchs, evidenced by in 1215 they signed the Magna Carta, which said basically that the king had to share his power with Parliament, which worked out pretty well. The king was not absolute. He had to share his power for a long period of time until some problems occurred with the Tudor monarchs. Guys like Henry VIII and Elizabeth I started taking more and more power, started to ignore Parliament, which is going to cause some problems. It's really caused problems when Elizabeth I did not have a male heir, and so their cousins from Scotland take over, and they don't believe in the Magna Carta. They didn't sign the Magna Carta. They were very absolutist, and this is going to cause some problems because England does not want an absolute monarch. And so they go to a civil war, known as the English Civil War, between the Roundheads and Cavaliers. Roundheads were backed by Parliament, and that was Oliver Cromwell who led them. Cavaliers backed the king, and the King Charles I was the king that took over from Scotland. And in the end, the Roundheads won. Oliver Cromwell's troops won, and they behead Charles I. And Oliver Cromwell says, I'm going to work with Parliament. I'm just going to be the leader that works with Parliament. However, he doesn't live up to that promise. He becomes very absolutist and dictator-like, which is going to cause more problems in England. So, because of his absolute nature, what England decides is that they're going to bring back the king. They realized they had it better before. However, they beheaded their old king. So what they're going to do is take his son, Charles II, and bring him back. And we call this the restoration. They restore the crown or restore the king back to power, taking over for Oliver Cromwell. So they cut Oliver Cromwell's head off too, by the way. And basically the same thing happens. It's a repeat of his dad. He abuses his power. He ignores Parliament. He becomes very absolute again. That's his nature. What did you expect was going to happen? To cause even further problems, the heir to the throne, Charles II's son, James II, is not only absolutist, but he's Catholic, which now is a huge problem. He's both Catholic and absolutist, which England hates. If you remember, Henry VIII and Elizabeth I both made the country of England Protestant. Now everybody is Protestant during this time. And James II listens to the Pope in Rome. And so that's a huge problem they do not want to happen in England. Their solution was, let's call in a cousin of his that is Protestant and get him to marry another famous Englishman, William of Orange. And together, they will rule the country as Protestants if they agree to sign a document that we're going to call the English Bill of Rights, basically saying that Parliament is supreme over the king. All right, basically the equivalent to our Congress is more powerful than the equivalent to our president. And this is a big deal. So Parliament is now going to reign supreme over what anything the kings or queens say in England for the rest of history. So William and Mary take over in what we call the Glorious Revolution because James II realized what happened to Charles I, his grandfather, and basically just got out of town and kept his head. He didn't want to be executed. So it was a bloodless revolution, which we call the Glorious Revolution for that reason. It was very peaceful and takeover. And William and Mary would become beloved rulers of England and lead them into a very successful time period in their history. Now everybody in England is happy. They have Protestant rulers and William and Mary that signed the English Bill of Rights, which forced them to limit their power. And so they became a limited parliamentary monarchy, which they still are today. That, again, is where Parliament is now supreme over the monarch's power. So absolutism was now dead in England.